If you are watching this on March 19th, 2026, you need to understand that what you are about to hear is not a political drama, not a cable news debate, and not a hypothetical exercise about alliance dynamics. What happened between the United States, Canada, and NATO over the past several weeks is the single most consequential rupture in the Western alliance since it was built from the rubble of World War II. An American president who spent years telling allies he did not need them, who spent months threatening to absorb Canada as a 51st state, who called NATO members ungrateful freeloaders, who tariffed his closest partners as if they were adversaries, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of a coordinated counterstrike so precise and so devastating that his own cabinet was preparing to remove him from office. And the man who engineered it was not a general, not a rival superpower, and not a rogue regime. It was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, and what he pulled off in the span of a few weeks will be studied in every foreign policy program on Earth for the next 50 years. To understand the full weight of what Carney did, you need to understand what brought the United States and Canada to this breaking point in the first place. As Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney himself described it, this was a rupture, a moment in which an old order collapsed and a new one struggled to be born. The relationship between the two countries, which had been the closest and most economically integrated bilateral partnership anywhere on the planet, did not collapse because of a single event. It collapsed because Donald Trump made a deliberate political choice to treat America's most reliable neighbor not as a partner, but as a target. Trump left open the possibility of a military invasion of a NATO ally in Greenland, talked about making Canada the 51st state in ways that Canada and most of the world regarded as deeply offensive, targeted allies with tariffs while sometimes playing softer with adversaries, and regularly made inflammatory remarks at international gatherings as if he were trying to bully U.S. allies rather than maintain the relationships America had spent 80 years building. And the allies, led by Carney, quietly began building a response. Canada entered 2026 at what Carney called a hinge moment in its history, with its long-standing relationship with the United States, based on ever-increasing economic integration and a rock-solid security partnership, effectively finished as it had previously existed. Carney understood something that previous Canadian leaders had always been too cautious, too diplomatically careful, or too economically dependent to act on. The only language that would actually shift Trump's calculations was not diplomacy, not appeals to shared history, and not careful statements of concern. The only language that would work was the language of consequences. Hard, concrete, economically devastating consequences that Trump's own advisors and cabinet members could not explain away or manage around. So Carney built those consequences, piece by piece, in coordination with European allies and with people inside the American system who had quietly concluded that something had to give. The crisis that brought everything to a head involved Canada presenting the United States with 5 specific requirements. A set of demands that amounted to a comprehensive reversal of Trump's most aggressive positions toward his northern neighbor. Remove all tariffs on Canadian goods. Reaffirm the American commitment to NORAD and to intelligence sharing without conditions. Acknowledge that Canadian territory is sovereign and that previous statements suggesting otherwise did not reflect American policy. Pay Canada $14.7 billion in compensation for economic damages caused by the tariff campaign. And formally recognize Canadian sovereignty over natural resources within Canadian territory without qualification. These were not negotiating positions. These were the 5 requirements, delivered with a deadline, and backed by the most extraordinary diplomatic maneuver in the modern history of the Western Alliance. What Carney did to enforce those requirements was use Article 3 of the NATO Treaty in a way no member state had ever attempted before. Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty requires member states to maintain the individual and collective economic and military capacity to resist armed attack, and to contribute to collective defense. It is one of the foundational pillars of the entire alliance architecture. Canada's foreign minister presented the North Atlantic Council in a closed-door session with a direct argument. The United States government's confrontational behavior toward Canada, a fellow NATO member, had not only caused $9.22 trillion in American market losses and threatened 4.8 million American jobs, it had disrupted supply chains for critical defense materials and had fundamentally eroded the trust of 28 NATO members in American leadership. Therefore, the United States was in violation of its own Article 3 obligations, and NATO had both the authority and the obligation to respond. The vote was held. 28 nations voted in favor of invoking Article 3 against the United States. Only 4 voted against: the United States itself, Hungary, Turkey, and Slovakia. The United States was outvoted 28-4 within the alliance it had created, funded, and led for 77 consecutive years. That sentence needs to sit with you for a moment before we continue. 28 nations, including every major European power and Canada, voted to financially isolate the United States within its own military alliance. Not because they were enemies of America, not because they wanted to see the United States weakened, but because a critical mass of American allies had concluded that the only way to preserve the Western alliance was to confront the force that was destroying it from within. NATO suspended United States access to $47 billion in alliance common funding. It froze American participation in joint procurement programs worth $89 billion over 5 years. Programs covering F-35 fighter jet components, Patriot missile systems, artillery ammunition, and naval equipment. It suspended American companies' eligibility for NATO defense contracts worth $124 billion annually. Contracts that had been sustaining tens of thousands of jobs at Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and hundreds of smaller defense contractors. And it prohibited American military officers from commanding any NATO operations or exercises, ordering that command positions be transferred to non-American officers within 30 days. That last measure was not just economically significant, it was symbolically and strategically devastating in a way that cut to the very core of American military identity. The United States currently holds 63% of senior command positions within NATO, including the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. For the first time since World War II, American officers were being told they would not be leading the alliance they had built. This was the most significant reduction in American military command authority in living memory, and it landed at the Pentagon with the force of a detonation. 3 minutes after the NATO announcement, the Secretary of Defense convened an emergency meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The assessment delivered in that room was unsparing. American forces in Europe depend on NATO infrastructure. American military operations depend on NATO coordination. The American defense industry depends on NATO contracts. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs reportedly described what had just happened as the worst single blow to American military capability in modern history. And the vice chairman added that if the suspension continued for more than a few weeks, the consequences would cascade. Training exercises canceled, equipment deliveries delayed, command structures fragmenting, the ability to respond to threats in Europe degraded, and defense contractors beginning mass layoffs that would reduce long-term production capacity for years. None of these were hypothetical projections. They were the immediate, operational, real-world consequences of the decision that 28 democracies had just made. This confrontation did not emerge from nowhere. Trump had spent years alienating the very allies he now found himself dependent on, regularly making incendiary remarks at international gatherings and acting as if he were trying to bully partners rather than maintain relationships. And this had led Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and others to suggest that their best course forward was a decoupling from the United States. The decoupling that Trump had treated as a bluff turned out to be a plan. And now Trump was facing the reality of what that plan looked like when it was fully activated. Just days before the climax of the crisis, Trump had publicly complained about NATO's refusal to join the United States in the war with Iran, calling the decision disappointing and bad for the partnership. A president who had spent years telling allies he did not need them was now discovering, in the most brutal possible way, that the opposite was true. The final 13 minutes before Trump's noon deadline were the most consequential 13 minutes in the history of the American presidency since the Cuban Missile Crisis. At 11:50 in the morning, the Secretary of Defense was briefed on the NATO decision while already in an emergency meeting with the Joint Chiefs. At 11:52, he called the White House and told the president that NATO had just cut America off and that the cabinet was prepared to invoke the 25th Amendment if Trump did not accept Canada's 5 requirements before noon. At 11:54, the Secretary of State called with the same message and the same countdown. At 11:55, the Vice President called to inform Trump that he had received letters from 11 cabinet members invoking the 25th Amendment, and that if Trump did not comply by noon, those letters would be transmitted to Congress at 12:01, and the Vice President would assume the powers of acting president. Trump was alone in the Oval Office with his Chief of Staff. According to sources, Trump said, "They are all against me, my own people, NATO, everyone." His Chief of Staff reportedly told him he had 4 minutes and needed to make a decision. At 11:57, Trump said, "If I do this, I am finished politically." His Chief of Staff reportedly responded, "If you do not do this, you are finished as president in 3 minutes." At 11:58, Trump picked up the phone and told the Secretary of State to call Canada and accept all 5 requirements. 1 minute before the deadline, 60 seconds from removal. At 12:01, the White House released the statement. All tariffs on Canadian goods removed effective immediately. American commitment to NORAD reaffirmed without conditions. Canadian sovereignty acknowledged. $14.7 billion in compensation to be paid within 7 days. Canadian sovereignty over natural resources formally recognized without qualification. At 12:03, Carney held a press conference in Ottawa. He confirmed that the United States had accepted all 5 requirements and announced that Canada was immediately suspending its Emergencies Act measures, restoring energy exports to the United States, unfreezing American assets, lifting export controls, and beginning the process of normalizing relations. At 12:05, NATO suspended the Article 3 sanctions pending verification of implementation. At 12:10, markets reacted in a way that told you everything you needed to know about how much economic damage the crisis had already caused. The Dow Jones, which had been down over 2,000 points in pre-market trading on fears Trump would miss the deadline, surged over 3,000 points in the first 5 minutes after the announcement. The S&P 500 jumped more than 12%. Over $2 trillion in market value was created in minutes as investors processed the simple fact that the crisis was over. The broader backdrop makes Carney's achievement even more remarkable. Trump had been publicly calling on NATO members, including Canada, to help the United States secure the Strait of Hormuz during the Iran war, while simultaneously having spent months saying he did not need help from any of those countries, insisting as recently as March 7th that the UK's offer of an aircraft carrier was unnecessary because victory had already been achieved. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister made clear that to Canada's knowledge, no formal request had even been made to NATO for the Strait of Hormuz assistance Trump was publicly demanding, noting that conversations among NATO allies on that subject had not yet occurred. The United States was simultaneously asking allies to bail it out in the Middle East and threatening to financially and militarily isolate itself from those same allies over the Canada dispute. The contradiction was not lost on anyone, and the allies had made their choice. What this crisis revealed, and what analysts across the political spectrum are now openly discussing, is that Canada's long-standing security arrangement with the United States can no longer be taken as a given, and that the need for Canada to significantly increase its own defense spending, build its own Arctic capabilities, and deepen its ties with European NATO partners has become urgently clear. The relationship that existed between Washington and Ottawa before January 2025 is not coming back. It cannot come back because too much has been revealed. Canada has demonstrated that it can defeat the United States economically and diplomatically when it builds the right coalitions, moves at the right moment, and refuses to be intimidated by a partner that has chosen to weaponize the relationship. And every American ally watching from every capital on Earth drew the same conclusion from what just happened. If Canada can do this to the United States, the rules of the Western Alliance have fundamentally changed. The era in which Washington could count on its partners to absorb punishment indefinitely because they had nowhere else to go is over. The multipolar moment that analysts had been describing as an emerging trend is no longer emerging. It arrived. It arrived at 11:58 in the morning on a day when the President of the United States had 60 seconds left in his presidency and chose to blink. The world noticed, and the world will not forget.